Edward Thompson.
I wanted to revert to earlier, a more general question that's come up, I think, several times, which is the use of the word society and societies. I think this may indicate a certain purely empirically locatable difference in the way some historians, some anthropologists think. But I find it always very difficult. I always have to check myself and say, what is this thing, this society? Whereas there seems to be a tendency in some anthropological thinking to say, well, there is a society, then we know what it is. And historians find it very difficult to say what this is. When you ask Ralph Samuel how he would set about describing the social structure or the society of the Headington Forest, he backed away from it. Now, I don't know why he backed away from it, but I could see myself backing away in the same way if you'd asked me about my early 18th century forest communities. I would tend to prefer to use the word community describing this than a society, because the question will be raised in Headington or in Windsor Forest, are you dealing with a parasitic society, parasitic upon another larger society, or a marginal society, or is this characteristic of a larger society? And then you might be led, if you began to look at the larger society, into lines of argument that Wallerstein or someone gives us, in which you're beginning to see this as part of the world economy. And then you're led to the question of, are you to see this society as it's perceived conventionally in the newspapers, by the magistrates, by the police, and conventional opinion of the time, or as it's perceived by the majority of labourers or foresters at the time, and the perceptions will be very different. And the second will be very much more difficult to recover historically than the first, and the techniques and methods used will be very difficult. Or are you to say that this society can only be seen by putting together opposed views of self-perception within that society? Now, I think in my own, just as a sort of comment upon my own work, and I think many other historians share this is probably an improper comment to make on your paper, but because I'm really talking about something rather different. But the questions, what, why, and how, are very often not the questions in one's own historical work. One is asking so much as who and whom. And I think one has to put those questions together with your questions. I put them back at Gellner too. I mean, he tells us with some confidence that he knows there are three causes, which are economic, coercive, and ideological. And I would say again, whom, that all those causes in the societies that I study operate through, are operative within societies which I cannot study without some concept of contradiction and some concept of class. Now, I don't think that the kind of concept of contradiction and the kind of concept of class should be taken as a universal and should be then read back and imposed. And I agree very much with what Godelier said in his paper about not reading back contemporary or modern concepts of contradiction and class. But nevertheless, that is the kind of problem which historians are always dealing with. So that to deal with a society, one tends to be offered, as a historian of the last 300 years say, various alternative ways of doing it. One is the positivist way. Of course, we all know what a society is, and we can count it, or we can find a positive, objective, quantitative criterion. Now, the problem about this is that it can often mean that you can describe a society independent of how that society is perceived by the people who live in it. And this I would certainly reject for reasons which I don't think I have to argue here, but I can certainly say I would very, very strictly reject this. I don't think you can talk about a society independent of people's consciousness and perception. I do not think you can talk about a social structure independent of the categories and concepts which govern that social structure, any more than you can talk about money independently of the categories of money itself. So too often, the sternest and most rigorous attempts to describe in a positivist way a society, independent of how it is perceived, leaves us with something that is not that society. And another alternative, of course, is to then adopt a structuralist solution, which is to establish a model, however sophisticated, of the structure of that society. And this can involve us in the central problem this seminar is discussing, precisely the problem of change, once you've established this structural organization. So I want to end with a very banal comment. A very banal comment indeed, which is that I was terrified by all the theoretical thunder about 10 years ago into believing, like many of my more advanced historical colleagues today, that the most stupid form of history was, was narrative history. And tended, in my own work in the last 10 years, to opt for a more themal organization of my work, sometimes the themes being selected, in a sense, by preoccupations of social anthropology. And I've now come to the view that while this is a very fertile and useful thing to do, in the end, the most exacting, and I mean analytically exacting, account of the process of change can only be embodied in the fullest scale in narrative history. I don't mean empty narrative history, but I mean analytical narrative history informed by this conceptualization and self-consciousness about it and themal organization of it. But in the end, you have to put those things back together, because a structure alone is not the same thing as the actual eventuation of history itself. Yeah. And only when you consider it in operation, then I think we have to then examine once again and think again about what we mean by historical logic, what historical logic is. Well, this is too big for me, and I'm not competent to really try and talk about this, but in the sense that in modern history, since change is very rapid, and much more rapid than it is in certain earlier societies, it is, although a very imperfect laboratory, a continual laboratory for testing concepts. Because if A, B, and C are related in these ways and not in other ways, historical logic will suggest that they will give rise to D rather than to F, G, and Y. Now, your logic may be faulty, but other historians can play it back. And this, I think, is what one is doing all the time. One is saying there is this structural organization of society. That is why the event, analytically examined, eventuates in D. And then other historians will come and examine that logic in the light of their own empirical investigation to see if another factor, F, has been looked at, a contingency has been left out of this examination which alters the whole logic.
To what extent and for what reason would you give an account of change over time with concepts which contemporaries would not have used?
Well, I'm much preoccupied with this all the time in the question of class, because I think we use class in two quite different ways. And I think when I'm talking about the making of the English working class, I am talking about something which actually has an observable empirical content. If I'm using the concept of class in dealing with 18th century plebeian culture, I'm using a heuristic concept, an analytical concept, without which I cannot explain. But it is not empty of empirical content. That is, in the sense that if riot performs this kind of function, if the hegemony of the ruling class can only be held by this kind of modulation of permissiveness and terror, this can be explained only by seeing a polarization, a field of force within that society, which we call class. And that is the empirical content, that is the examination of the actual events and mediation of social relations as observed. But I'm very much aware of this problem. I think probably historians must increasingly become aware of this problem, that one often has concepts which in one position may have an empirical, manifest empirical quality, and in another position are heuristic. And people get confused. One moves between these two uses and often is self-confused by it. I'm sure I have been.
So you'd make a conscious choice between alternative conceptualizations like classes and Stender at every point in the research?
I think one should, yes. I think one should become self-conscious of this, yes. And be willing to justify it, yes.
Oh, it's good.